this part. Being MC. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you here. My name is Abena Busia. I'm chair of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies here. I'm also a very proud official lifetime member of the African Studies Association. And I think an unofficial lifetime member of the executive of the Center for African Studies, on whose behalf I am proud to say hello. The Center for African Studies is, every year since African Studies became a part of Rutgers, I'm very proud to host the African Studies Association Presidential Lecture, which is a wonderful thing for us. And with due respects to all past presidents, this year we're doubly proud. Because, as we know, the current president of African Studies is our very own Professor Dorothy Hodgson. But before we get to her, the Center for African Studies plays host and is the neighbor of the African Studies Association. But we are really here by the grace of the School of Arts and Sciences. So I'm very happy to ask you to welcome the Executive Vice Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, Professor Jim Michelli, who will give the official welcome on behalf of Rutgers University.
Thank you, Abby. I've been called many things in my life, but I don't know if I've ever been called a hurdle on the way to the speaker before. So it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to this talk today. I think we have actually three things that we can celebrate and combine them into this one event. So those of you who are coming from outside of Rutgers may not know that this is actually Rutgers' 250th anniversary as an institution of higher education. We're the 8th oldest institution in the United States. And to celebrate this great event for us, we have a great commencement speaker plan. President Obama has announced that he will be giving the speech. So this is a real coup for us, and we're delighted that in a couple of weeks we'll welcome the president to campus. I also think the second thing that we're celebrating is something that Abby already mentioned, and that is the fact that our own Dorothy Hodgson is president of the African Studies Association this year. So we're very pleased that Dorothy has this position and also that she's here to speak to us today. And the third thing I realized is that Abby also mentioned the relationship between the African Studies Association and the Center for African Studies here at Rutgers. And I realized that this is a relationship that goes back to 1996. So we're now celebrating the 20th anniversary of this relationship between the Center for African Studies and the African Studies Association. And I think that is something to stop and take reckon with. The Center for African Studies, of course, has been a very successful organization at Rutgers University. We have, by my estimate, somewhere around 35 faculty members within the School of Arts and Sciences who are in the center. We have a dozen or so people from outside the School of Arts and Sciences who are also active in the organization. I think we have a great opportunity now with the new merger with the medical school to bring yet more people into that fold, and I'm looking forward to seeing that happen over the next few years. We have about 10 departments in the School of Arts and Sciences that are represented in the Center for African Studies. So this has been a very fruitful and productive relationship to have the African Studies Association located at Rutgers University and collaborating on a regular basis with the Center for African Studies. So I'm delighted that the School of Arts and Sciences has been able to support this. I'm delighted that you're here today with us, and I look forward to a great talk in a few minutes. Thank you.
And as I mentioned, for us at the center, this lecture is one of the perks of having the African Studies Association here. Where they gather for their board meeting, and we manage to sort of distract them for an evening to hear from their president And so I'm also pleased to welcome, to say a few words to us, Suzanne Moyet Bizet, who's the executive director of the Center of the African Studies Association. Suzanne, thank you.
Good afternoon. I just want to say a few words really quickly to talk about what exactly the African Studies Association is, and to just say a few words from the African Studies Association perspective about the long and wonderful relationship that we've had with Rutgers. As we said, this year is a very special occurrence. We actually have 2 Rutgers faculty members currently serving on our board of directors, and we have some other Rutgers faculty that are coming in on the new slate for our nominations. And so it's very exciting to see that there is this strong collaboration between Rutgers and ASA, which really has such a long history. And so the African Studies Association is the official learned society of African studies. Our organization is a membership association. We have more than 2,000 individual and institutional members worldwide, which include really just about every discipline you can imagine. Scholars, researchers, activists, practitioners who are working on really a myriad of issues, topics, and disciplines around Africa. What our organization does, in addition to organizing wonderful presidential lectures here at Rutgers once a year, our biggest really event of the year is our annual meeting. Our annual meeting takes place in a different location every year. It's taking place this year in Washington, D.C. from December 1st through 3rd. And that conference brings together between 2,000 and 3,000 people from around the world. We have over 1,000 people that actually present their research and their work on the program at that meeting. And it really is an incredible experience. For any of you who have not had the opportunity to make it to the meeting, we would really invite you to join us. In addition to that, we also publish 2 scholarly journals. We publish the African Studies Review and History in Africa. And we do a lot of work around advocacy, outreach, and support in general for really all people worldwide that are our members that are doing work on Africa. Just to say a few words about our relationship with Rutgers, it is actually the longest that the African Studies Association has been based at an institution, and there is a reason why. Rutgers has really shown, you should all be very, very proud of your institution. You have shown a very, very strong commitment to both host a learned society and to put an emphasis on the importance of area studies, on the importance of interdisciplinary work on Africa, and at the same time to specifically host such a wonderful, wonderful faculty that are doing important work on Africa that have allowed this continued relationship to happen. So on behalf of the African Studies Association, I welcome all of you. Visit us at africanstudies.org. You can check out our website, find more about our publications, about our meetings, and we really look forward to seeing you at one of our events. And we are so happy to be part of the Rutgers community and to be with you today. Thank you.
Now for my last introduction. I owe Stefan Robelin a lot because 2 years ago I was part of the nominations committee when we were looking for a new director to replace Usaina Alidou. And I had a young colleague in the English department who was going through tenure at the time. And I went and basically press-ganged him into, flexing his wings and feeling the security of having tenure by taking on a crazy job. And he very kindly said yes and, of course, got elected. So Stefan Robelin is the current director of the Center for African Studies. He's a professor of English here, as am I. And so I'm very happy to ask Stefan to come up and introduce our distinguished speaker for the day, to introduce our colleague, Dorothy Hodgson, the president of the African Studies Association.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Abby, for your introductions today. I should say that among the number of convergences we are celebrating today, I should add that today is Abba Nabusia's birthday. Abby's been a pillar and a lifelong member of the Center for African Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and English at Rutgers here. And so we wish you a very happy birthday, and we're so pleased that you're spending this special day with us. I also want to extend a warm welcome to each of you on behalf of the Center for African Studies. In particular, I'd like to just take a moment and ask that the members of the Board of Directors who have flown in from out of town, the Board of Directors for ASA, as well as the administrators, to stand up and just be recognized. Thank you for coming. I also want to extend a heartfelt thank you to Renee Delancey and Martine Adams for their tireless efforts to put this event together. I want to recognize and thank our very generous co-sponsors, without whom this event would have been impossible. The African Studies Association, the Alexander Library, the Department of Anthropology, the Gaia Centers, the Dean's Office at the School of Arts and Sciences, as well as undergraduate academic affairs. And so it's indeed an honor for the Center for African Studies to join with these other supporters and host this event. As it's been said, it's a privilege each and every year to present a preeminent Africanist to the Rutgers community. But this year, there's a special pride and joy in the fact that this preeminent Africanist we can call our own. Dorothy Hodgson came to Rutgers in 1995, having earned her BA in English at the University of Virginia, and her master's and PhD in anthropology at the University of Michigan. Since that time, Dorothy's distinguished herself in the various fields that she served: anthropology, women's and gender studies, and African studies. She currently serves as the president of the African Studies Association, the reason we're gathered here today, but also has served as chair of the Department of Anthropology, the director of Rutgers Institute for Research on Women, and the president of the Association for Feminist Anthropology. She's also currently the director of graduate studies in anthropology, where she teaches a variety of courses on gender and Africa. I should pause to underscore in all this service the synergy of Dorothy's institutional prowess. In 1996, when the ASA had announced that it was looking for a new institutional home, then Assistant Professor Hodgson, along with her fellow Africanist husband and current Dean of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Rick Schrader, organized fellow Africanists from across the university in an attempt to try to woo the ASA to Rutgers. And legend has it that in these meetings, they were filled with amazing potlucks and outstanding music. I don't know why. They helped form the Rutgers African Studies Coordinating Committee, which did manage to secure Rutgers as the host institution of the ASA. The Coordinating Committee then became the basis for the Center for African Studies in 1999. That Dorothy is giving the presidential address for the association she helped bring to Rutgers, an event that is hosted by the center that she helped found. Well, that's a testament to Dorothy's remarkable commitment, initiative, and determination. And so today we celebrate these traits as well as Dorothy's success. This is really quite an alignment, an institutional alignment taking place today. Dorothy, of course, has also made her mark through her scholarship, which represents a well of frequently cited field-altering feminist work on gender roles in Africa. As a historical anthropologist whose work is based in Tanzania, primarily among Maasai pastoralists and agro-pastoralists, her wide-ranging studies engage matters of gender, ethnicity, cultural politics, colonization, modernity, nationalism, the missionary encounter, transnational organizing, and the indigenous rights movement. She's authored 4 monographs, including Being Maasai, Becoming Indigenous, Post-Colonial Politics in a Neoliberal World, which won honorable mention for the Senior Book Award from the American Ethnological Society. Also, The Church of Women, Gendered Encounters Between Maasai and Missionaries. And the forthcoming study, Gender, Justice, and the Problem of Culture, from Customary Law to Human Rights in Tanzania. In addition to authoring over 30 journal articles or book chapters, Dorothy has edited or co-edited 5 volumes, including Gender and Culture at the Limit of Rights, and most recently, the Gender, Culture, and Power Reader. Another exciting volume entitled Global Africa is well in progress, and just this past fall, Dorothy and her co-editor Judith Byfield hosted all the contributors to that volume here at Rutgers for an outstanding 2-day workshop. For all her scholarly and institutional accomplishments, Dorothy's been recognized by numerous institutions with prestigious honors, grants, and awards. She's earned fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Rockefeller Foundation for a coveted stint at the Bellagio Center. She's also won 2 National Endowment for the Humanities fellowships. This afternoon, I think you'll see precisely why Dorothy has become valued for the transformative scholar that she is, as she presents her talk entitled Gender, Justice, Human Rights, and the Problem of Culture. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dorothy Hodgson to the podium.
Wow. So this is exciting. As I was telling some of my colleagues, usually here at Rutgers, when we're with other faculty and colleagues, we're talking about resources or process or something, and we rarely actually get to share our work. We go elsewhere to do this. So this is such a pleasure and a privilege to have this opportunity to share some work actually from my forthcoming book. And I want to thank the Center for African Studies Association, School for Arts and Sciences, Gaia Centers, and everyone who's helped to kind of make this possible, and all of you for coming in on a rainy day. So my talk today explores how what is often referred to as the problem of culture in contemporary debates about human rights shapes the experience and expression of gender justice by so-called grassroots women in Africa. I believe, and I am an anthropologist, that how culture is represented, deployed, and contested by various actors and institutions involved in women's human rights internationally, nationally, and locally is a key site of struggle between these actors. A struggle that not only reveals the continued marginalization of the voices and visions of grassroots women in shaping the terms of the debate, but also obscures their sometimes powerful and culturally meaningful ways of confronting and challenging injustice. Within discussions of human rights, the very definition of culture is controversial. Does culture refer to fixed, dated, traditional beliefs and practices, which are often represented as obstacles to progress, enlightenment, and emancipation on the part of the other, especially poor women living in remote rural areas, but not a feature of elite societies with our education, mobility, and cosmopolitanism? Or is culture merely performance? Clothes, adornment, songs, and dances to be admired and photographed as colorful, nostalgic reminders of simpler times. If, like anthropologists, historians, and other scholars, we understand culture to refer to the meanings, ideas, and practices that shape and are shaped by people's everyday interactions, then culture is instead a dynamic, historical, contested part of all of our lives and institutions. As such, cultural ideas and practices can be a source of strength as well as oppression, depending on the context and conditions. Thus, many of us involved in the women's human rights debate share certain questions and concerns about culture. Who is deploying the language of culture? States, elites, activists from the global south or the global north? How, why, and in what context? Why, as Peggy Levitt and Sally Engelmary ask in a recent article, does culture only seem to emerge as an issue in debates about women's rights, but not in other domains of rights talk, such as the right to food or the right to freedom from torture? Culture is frequently characterized by Western feminists, elite Africans, and others as a key source of the oppression of rural uneducated women because of the continued existence of so-called traditional harmful practices, such as FGM, polygamy, and arranged marriage. Not only, as I'm going to argue today, are such characterizations ahistorical and uninformed, but they overlook how certain cultural practices and meanings have instead historically served as a source of power and authority for women. These representations of grassroots women also shape interventions into their lives by national and international women's organizations in the name of women's human rights that obscure and marginalize these women's own priorities and agendas. So in this talk, I'm going to draw on examples from my long-term historical and ethnographic research with Maasai pastoralists in Tanzania to argue three things. First, that the problem of culture is really a problem of power. Secondly, that a historical perspective is essential to understanding these local global struggles over rights, justice, and culture. And finally, for the importance of a more expansive understanding of gender justice that recognizes alternative approaches to framing and seeking justice by, for, and on behalf of women and men. This talk draws, let's see if I can get rid of that. This talk draws from my forthcoming book called Gender Justice and the Problem of Culture, From Customary Law to Human Rights in Tanzania, which is based on over 30 years somehow of ethnographic and historical, I started when I was 10, ethnographic and historical research among and with people who self-identify very fiercely as Maasai in Tanzania, an array of interviews and engagements with women activists from other African countries, and critical studies of the work of several prominent local, national, and international women's advocacy organizations on the continent. Since our colleague Charlotte Bunch and others first argued in the early 1990s for the need to reframe human rights to recognize and support women's rights are human rights has become a global mantra, circulated and supported by a vast network of feminist activists, donors, and even certain states. As a result, women and men around the world have reframed many of their often long-standing demands and needs in the seemingly more powerful language of rights in order to expand the visibility of their issues at different political levels and to demand accountability from states in ensuring and enforcing their legal rights. And by many accounts, the institutionalization and expansion of women's rights as human rights has provided an effective and potent way to challenge gender inequality, improve women's legal and political status, and protect women from acts of individual and collective violence. Despite these successes, however, a growing number of scholars, policymakers, and activists have become increasingly wary of the dominance of rights-based approaches to social justice and increasingly development. Some, like Amrita Basu, allege that human rights are merely a contemporary form of imperial intervention, yet another effort by the global north to impose its values and views on the global south. Others claim that the human rights framework is still fundamentally androcentric in its assumptions, institutions, and manifestations. And finally, as I discussed before, increasing numbers of scholars and activists, including myself, are concerned with how culture has been deployed and disparaged by some activists and institutions, and most importantly for me, the consequences of these representations of culture for the everyday lives and struggles of the people with whom we work. So I don't have time here to trace the various invocations of culture in various international and national laws, decrees, and protocols, so I'm going to provide you two examples. The first is from the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which was approved by the UN General Assembly in 1993. Among other things, the Declaration claimed that certain kinds of women, including, quote, women belonging to minority groups, indigenous women, and women living in rural and remote communities were, quote, especially vulnerable to violence. It included in its description of forms of violence against women, quote, female genital mutilation and other traditional practices harmful to women, and urged states to, quote, adopt all measures, especially in the field of education, to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women, and to eliminate prejudices, customary practices, and all other practices based on the idea of the inferiority or superiority of either of the sexes, and on stereotyped roles for men and women. So the 1993 Declaration thus depicts minority, indigenous, and rural women as somehow more vulnerable to violence than others to violence. It reframes FGM as a form of violence against women, warns about other such, quote, traditional harmful practices, and presumes that men and women across the globe seek lives in which gender differences are completely eradicated. 10 years later, the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa, which was adopted by the African Union in 2003 and ratified in 2005, called for the elimination of, quote, harmful cultural and traditional practices, specifically FGM and scarification, and decreed that the minimum age for marriage for women should be 18 years old, and that, quote, monogamy is encouraged as a preferred form of marriage. The protocol recognized, however, that culture could have positive aspects. Article 17 called for a woman's right to, quote, live in a positive cultural context and to participate in the determination of cultural policies. So as these examples suggest, in general, rural women were depicted as somehow needing increased protections, in part because some of their customary practices, like early marriage, female initiation, and polygamy, were now characterized, in part because of the domination of women's human rights, as, quote, harmful cultural and traditional practices by international protocols developed and debated by activists and others from the global north and the global south. Most of the African women who became active in the international women's rights movement in the 1980s and 1990s were necessarily elite, educated urban women, often activists, lawyers, and academics from dominant ethnic groups. They tended to share the modernist perspectives of their Western feminist counterparts, that rural, uneducated women like Maasai lived as victims in patriarchal worlds shaped forcefully by the drudgery of endless household labor, domestic violence, and backward cultural practices like polygamy, arranged marriage, and FGM. These women were associated with culture and tradition, precisely the domains the international women's movement was trying to challenge, with its liberal claims of universal human rights and values, premised on notions of individual agency and autonomy. Rural women could be spoken for and helped, but certainly had little to contribute to the struggle for women's advancement. For Maasai women in Tanzania, as for, I would argue, rural and educated women throughout the African continent, these characterizations of their lives were hardly new. Rather, they echoed repeated campaigns by colonial and post-colonial governments and various religious denominations to forcibly change other seemingly primitive aspects of Maasai culture, such as certain traditional practices, their clothing, their jewelry, their use of ochre to decorate their skins. Moreover, these representations say more, I think, about the assumptions and ignorance of these outsiders than the reality of Maasai women's lives. So now I'm going to give you just a very brief background. Maasai peoples, or people who now self-identify as Maasai, live in Kenya and Tanzania. Of course, like many peoples, they were split by the colonial border. For hundreds of years prior to colonial rule, most had relied primarily on the herding of cattle, goats, and sheep for their subsistence, supplemented as needed by trade for agricultural goods, and small-scale gathering by women in times of drought. Historical evidence suggests that Maasai gender relations were what we called complementary. That is, each gender age category had distinct roles, responsibilities, and rights, all of which had to be accomplished successfully for their households and homesteads. This is hard doing this on for their households and homesteads to prosper. In addition to childcare, cooking, and other domestic duties, Adult women shared use and access rights to family herds with their husbands, traveled widely to barter livestock products for food and other household goods, managed disputes among women, influenced the political decisions of male leaders, and were recognized by both men and women as the moral authorities of their communities because of their close spiritual relationship to Ngai, their predominantly female divinity. Over the past 100 years or so, however, as resources like land and livestock have become commoditized, men have been targeted as political leaders, household heads, and livestock owners by first colonial then post-colonial authorities, and women's moral authority and spiritual significance have been dismissed, pastoralist women have occupied increasingly vulnerable and dependent positions in their households and homesteads. They now hold only limited rights to livestock, lack inheritance rights and significant decision-making power, and have few ways to earn cash. Yet they are increasingly responsible for feeding and caring for their children, including paying any school fees or health-related costs. Very few are literate or speak Swahili, the national language. The precarious position of pastoralist families, especially pastoralist women and girls, has been exacerbated over the past few decades by the disproportionate impact of what we call neoliberal economic policies on pastoralists' right to land and access to quality education and health services, among other sectors. Briefly, through a succession of neoliberal policy reforms and practices, the Tanzanian state has privatized key industries, revised land regulations to encourage the sale of land, promoted large-scale commercial agriculture, expanded the highly profitable wildlife tourism and big game hunting sectors, instituted service fees for healthcare, and withdrawn support for education and other social services. As a result, there's been increased alienation of pastoralist lands, competition for water sources and other livestock-related resources, a decline in the use of health facilities, and increased impoverishment. And so, if you can recall the earlier map I showed, this is indeed the area where Maasai peoples live, and as you can see, much of that land is claimed for national parks, game reserves, other areas. And so, over time, they have some access to some of that land, but there's regulations in terms of what they're allowed to do on it. In 2005 and 2006, I conducted group and individual interviews with over 100 Maasai women throughout Tanzania about the changes in their lives, their problems, priorities, and agendas. In community after community, the women expressed the same urgent needs: hunger, poverty, lack of clean, accessible water, and for many, lack of functioning, affordable health facilities. And I should say that men echoed many of these same needs in my interviews with them. No one mentioned FGM, polygamy, or even arranged marriage as priorities for change. As one elderly Maasai woman, whom I have known for years, explained, quote, "Life has become much more difficult since you left. I had last seen her in 2001. There is no rain, no water, and no wood, and people are sicker and hungrier. It seems that people, especially children, are dying more often than in past years. One problem is that people are selling their land to outsiders and others. Someone has problems, and then they sell their land for money, and then the land is gone. We Maasai are like an old ripped cloth. It keeps getting tattered and torn, and soon there will be nothing left," end quote. In areas where land dispossession is most acute, the women have increasingly become involved in struggles over land. According to one Maasai activist, quote, "Women now sing about land issues and talk about men and the consequences of land sales. They tell the men, quote, 'We're not birds. We cannot just move from tree to tree once our land is gone.' They accuse the men of finishing them, of selling out, and not thinking about the future." Despite a shared, often poignant sense of their problems and priorities by both Maasai men and women, they experience continued disparagement of their cultural practices by elite Tanzanians and others, and paternalist interventions into their lives designed to improve and protect them, rather than to address the broader structural injustices such as land dispossession, political oppression, and enduring social discrimination in the provision of education and health services. that shape their sense of injustice and are their priorities for change. Currently, the main practice for which Maasai are condemned and disparaged is FGM. Since Fran Hoskin's controversial 1979 report helped to reframe FGM from a health issue to a human rights issue, the practice of FGM by a community has become a marker of their lack of modernity and a sign of the oppression of women. In response to international pressure, Tanzania criminalized the practice in 1998. And with the assistance of international NGOs and prominent Tanzanian feminist organizations, they launched a massive national campaign to eradicate the practice that focused on groups like Maasai in which it was still present. Thousands, if not millions of dollars have been spent on education and awareness-raising efforts to persuade Maasai men and women to stop the cutting, which, as I've discussed in some of my other work, is just one part of a multi-day series of ritual ceremonies that transform girls into marriageable women. The consequences of the international obsession with FGM for the daily lives and struggles of Maasai men and women have been profound. And again, I can only illustrate this with two brief examples. First, over the past decade, Maasai women have formed two very active, respected women's organizations, the Pastoralist Women's Council and PWC, and Maasai Women's Development Organization, Mutilation. PWC was founded and is led by Manda Ngoitiko, a formidable Maasai activist who struggled to leave her rural homestead and get educated, despite the initial reluctance of her father. Mutilation was founded and is led by Ndanini Kimisera Sika, a Maasai woman from a rural area who was sent to Dar es Salaam as a young girl, a large city in Tanzania, as a young girl for health reasons, and raised and schooled by her wealthy, educated uncle. Both of these organizations pursue a range of agendas, from assisting women's groups with loans and logistical support to develop income-generating projects, providing scholarships for the education of girls, and working for the political and economic empowerment of Maasai women. Rural Maasai women, both young and old, spoke very highly of both organizations and their leaders, praising them for their efforts to listen to them and work with them to improve their lives. The PWC, quote, brought light, explained one older woman to me, before we were blind. PWC opened our eyes, said another woman. Now we demand our rights because of PWC's teaching. Members proudly described becoming less financially dependent on men, learning how to speak up at public meetings, and recognizing their rights to own their own property. National and international feminist and development organizations, however, often treated these NGOs and their leaders with disdain because of their refusal to assist in the anti-FGM campaigns. When a Tanzanian feminist organization asked Manda and PWC to collaborate in its national anti-FGM campaign, Manda refused, quote, I told them it was not my priority. It would block my work. In response, the woman just told me, quote, you won't work against it because you are just an uneducated woman, end quote. Manda even refused an offer of approximately $150,000 from a German donor, quote, because I was not willing to work and campaign against the practice. Instead, I believe it should be dealt with indirectly by educating girls so that they can make their own decisions. Second example. In September 2005, I accompanied several members of Mutilation to Dar es Salaam to participate in the biannual Gender Festival, organized by two prominent Tanzanian feminist organizations, on the topic of gender democracy and development, popular struggles for an alternative and better world. The Gender Festival, which is actually a quite extraordinary event, ran for 4 days, and it included more than 2,000 men and women from academia, activist organizations, NGOs, villages, everyday life. One day I attended a workshop on, quote, African feminism, theories and discourses of resistance, with Mary and Nanyore, two somewhat educated Maasai women from Mutilation. At one point in the discussion in this workshop, a Tanzanian woman reminded everyone to, quote, remember the problem of culture. And this is her now talking. For example, among Maasai, where I have done research, women have no rights, they are forced to marry instead of go to school, and are forced to undergo female genital mutilation. Men can sleep around while women can't, end quote. Mary and Nanyore just rolled their eyes at me, but neither responded. Afterward, I asked them if they agreed with this woman. No, Nanyore replied, it is not that simple. And the problem is that it is always Maasai who are given as the example of cultural oppression, but they never think about their own cultural oppression. Perhaps more importantly, challenging polygamy, which was also raised in this discussion by this Tanzanian woman, and female cutting are not our priorities. Instead, she listed land rights, hunger, poverty, and education as the more important issues to be addressed. Both Manda's and Nanyore's comments that FGM was not their priority gets to the crux of the problem. While they and other Maasai activists may be, and indeed are, concerned about FGM, polygamy, and other cultural practices, they are far more alarmed by the increasing impoverishment, lack of political and legal rights, and marginalization of Maasai women and Maasai pastoralists more generally. What they find troubling is that dominant society in Tanzania, including the main feminist organizations, do not seem to listen to, recognize, or support their priorities. Instead, these groups continue to condemn and even criminalize Maasai for one specific cultural practice, FGM, and use its presence or absence as a measure of Maasai progress, modernity, and gender equality. Ironically, at the same time that Maasai women, like other rural women, are being attacked for the persistence of certain cultural practices, like FGM, that are viewed as a sign of their oppression, the existence of other cultural practices which actually empower women are frequently overlooked. Despite the international and national efforts to pressure Maasai women and their organizations to channel their energy and resources into anti-FGM campaigns, Maasai women have been actively pursuing justice in their own terms, drawing on enduring, culturally sanctioned forms of collective protest to express their anger over what they perceive as the economic and political injustice that continues to destroy their livelihoods, lands, and lives. For example, in April 2010, over 1,500 Maasai women from many different villages converged on Loliondo, which is a large town, a district headquarters in northern Tanzania, to turn in their membership cards to the longtime ruling political party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, or CCM. Many of the women disobeyed police warnings that they would be shot if they walked to Loliondo, and others were forcibly returned to their villages by trucks. Nonetheless, hundreds hid with their small children in the bushes overnight until the CCM office opened, then marched to the office and turned in 1,883 party membership cards. By renouncing their membership in CCM, the women were protesting the evictions of thousands of Maasai from their area a few months before by armed government security forces who burnt their homesteads, confiscated thousands of cattle, and violently attacked both men and women. They were also protesting a recently announced plan by the government to take away even more village land to create a buffer zone along the boundary of the Serengeti National Park, which is up in this area. As the women left to walk the many miles back to their villages, they sang, quote, "We are not for CCM, which sells our land." According to one report, one female leader, quote, exhorted the authorities not to accuse or arrest any staff from the civil society organizations in Loliondo, or the women would return in the thousands. Quote, "We have come to know our rights as women and as a community. This is our initiative." The response of the government, political party, and mainstream media was shocked disbelief at the capacity for women, especially largely illiterate rural Maasai women, to organize themselves. They instead accused various male leaders of instigating the actions. This protest is just one of actually a number of recent actions that Maasai women in northern Tanzania have staged over the past few years, which have included lying down on a local airstrip to prevent planes from a large Arab hunting firm from landing, traveling to Dar es Salaam to stage a rally and to demand an audience with the president. And there are accounts of similar collective actions by Maasai women in both the colonial and post-colonial periods, such as, for example, in 1977, when the government made a decree that all Maasai men and women had to wear modern dress, that is short shirts, pants, dresses, in order to be able to ride buses to town. And similarly, when I was working in community development in Tanzania in 1985, I witnessed a group of Maasai women decide to quit cooking for and sleeping with their husbands until the men agreed to stop trying to take over a lucrative transportation project that the women had implemented. It worked. Lysistrata in Tanzania. There is, as many of you know, a long history of similar collective protests and actions by women throughout the African continent. Perhaps most famously, the Igbo Women's War that took place in Nigeria in the 1930s. And among Maasai, these forms of female collective protest also have a long history and are recognized by both men and women as legitimate expressions of women's moral authority to punish people who violate the social order and to demand justice on behalf of themselves and their families. Now, in the past, these violations usually involved serious affronts to women's responsibilities and rights as mothers. For example, from a colonial report in 1910, quote, "In the event of a man having intercourse with a pregnant woman and thereby causing her to abort, he must submit to a punishment which is called okishoroto. All the women of the neighborhood collect together and, having stripped, seize the guilty person and flog him, after which they slaughter as many of his cattle as they can, strangling and suffocating the animals with their garments," which has a kind of ritual significance. Similar reports of okishoroto continue to the present over such violations as a man who has sex with his real or classificatory daughter, or men who prevent their wives from participating in their regular collective fertility gatherings. So while the substance and scale of women's demands in Loliondo are perhaps relatively new, challenging evictions, land dispossession, corrupt officials, and the resulting increase in the insecurity and precariousness of their families and livelihoods, the form, collective protest, has a long history, one based as elsewhere in their moral authority and political power of women as mothers. So although I wasn't present at the Loliondo protest, the published and unpublished accounts that I have read all say that most, if not all, of the women had small children with them. A clear statement that they were drawing on their status as mothers to protest and critique those they saw as most responsible for undermining their ability, frankly, their responsibility to care for their children and ensure their successful and secure futures. These women, in other words, perceived the assault on their families by the state as immoral. It's a violation of the social order and is an assault on their rights and responsibilities as mothers. Okay, so what can we learn from these stories about gender justice, human rights, and the problem of culture? The first is that, as I said, the problem of culture is really a problem of power. That is the continued assumption by many Euro-American donors and activists, and increasingly by many African elites, that they can speak for, rather than listen to, rural, poorly educated women, or even well-educated African women who are deemed culturally other. Several examples in this talk illustrate how the national and international women's movement itself, in its practices and policies towards Maasai women, has been complicit at times with what we might call imperialist recolonization. If these organizations really cared about the health and well-being of Maasai women, why not support them in addressing the economic and political causes of disease, hunger, and insecurity? And if they really cared about the human rights of Maasai women, why not support the economic and political rights that Maasai women are seeking to obtain? Even if we acknowledge the complicated interconnection of all rights, political, economic, cultural, and so forth, the question still remains a political one. Who decides which rights to pursue at any given time? And in this case, international and national obsessions with the practice of FGM has not only obscured or ignored the perspectives and priorities of Maasai women themselves, but obscured their own gendered modes of defining and demanding justice. A second conclusion is, I think, the need for more dynamic and complicated understandings of culture that pay attention to historical change and political economic context. A historical perspective on gender relations and cultural practices reveals the dynamism and the contingency of these categories and the implications and imbrications of power in their formations and reformations. As the Loliando protest and other examples suggest, most rural and educated Maasai women view culture as dynamic and often the site of female power and authority rather than female oppression. Moreover, and perhaps more importantly, they make clear that the problems they face today are not inherent to their cultures and traditions, but the product of broader political and economic forces such as colonialism, capitalism, the privatization of land and other natural resources that are depriving them of their lands and livelihoods and seriously eroding their economic security and thus their ability as mothers to ensure the future of their families. A related aspect is the need to recognize and respect alternative models of gender relations. In their conversations with me over the years, most Maasai women have made it clear that while they wanted equality vis-a-vis Maasai men and all Tanzanians, in terms of rights to control and inherit property and resources, and access to quality health, education, and other social services, they were not necessarily seeking equality in terms of what one explained to me as, quote, women taking men's roles and men taking women's roles. Instead, they seek a model of gender relations based on the complementarity of gender roles and responsibilities. In other words, they're seeking equality in terms of rights, but not necessarily roles. Most would be content, not all, but most would be content to pursue their historical responsibilities, caring for young and sick animals, managing milk processing and distribution, trading, cooking, caring for children, and so on, if, and this is an important if, the related rights and respect that used to accompany those roles were restored. But they also recognize that years of political and economic changes have undermined such possibilities, imposing new regimes of cash, commodities, private property, and wage labor that require new ways of being and surviving. And third conclusion is the need for more expansive ideas of what I'm calling gender justice that include but move beyond human rights approaches. So by gender justice, I mean the broad array of modes of defining and seeking justice between and among men and women, as well as the gendered assumptions and implications, of different forms. As well as the gendered assumptions and implications of different forms of justice. These forms of justice may include human rights, international and national laws and protocols, customary and religious modes of dispute resolution, collective action, and even vigilante justice. Clearly, the inclusion of women's rights as human rights has helped women throughout the world challenge oppressions of various kinds. But such a rights-based approach to justice often makes it difficult to recognize and address the structural causes and contexts of gender injustice, such as we've seen, the dismantling of healthcare, education, and other social services, and deepening impoverishment produced by the adoption and implementation of neoliberal policies and practices. In contrast to such rights-based frameworks, the idea of justice pursued by Maasai women is predicated on very different concepts of morality, collective responsibility, and oppression. Maasai women perceive themselves as having a moral obligation to challenge perceived violations to the social order, whether from incestuous men in the past or corrupt state and party officials in the present. Moreover, they emphasize the need and power of challenging these perceived injustices collectively, not as individuals. So in contrast to dominant human rights frameworks which promote individual agency and liberal ideas of gender equality, the collective actions of Maasai women express the importance of social connections and relationships rather than individual autonomy and rights, address the structural inequalities produced by colonialism and capitalism that have alienated them and their families from their lands and livelihoods, and directly challenge the involvement of the Tanzanian state in facilitating their disenfranchisement and oppression. So through these collective actions and other initiatives, Maasai women have challenged those who would disparage their culture and, more broadly, the vision, potential, and effectiveness of so-called grassroots women as agents of collective change. Moreover, by drawing on their long tradition of collective protest and modifying it to address current forms of injustice, They have emerged as a powerful political force to be reckoned with by the state and political party. As one Tanzanian reporter noted when commenting on the Loliondo protests, quote, "In the past, the Maasai were renowned for their warrior force, the Moran. The age set still open and closed to new spear carriers. But today, the formidable army of the Maasai is their women." Thank you.
Thank you. Dorothy has kindly agreed to do Q&A. Do we have microphones?
I can just stand.
You can just do it?
Yeah.
All right.
You can
Thank
shut me down. So questions, comments, concerns. Let me say two things I don't state directly. I am not a proponent of FGM. Let me make that clear. I'm very concerned with the politics of it. I also want to say that while I use FGM in the talk, in my own language, I like to talk about female genital modification rather than mutilation, in part because I believe that we need to include in that conversation practices like labiaplasty and vaginoplasty that just featured in the New York Times, actually around teenagers, God forbid, this past week, but that are increasingly common in the US and Europe and so forth. And that is adult and now, I guess, teenage women consenting and deciding that they have to have kind of genital surgery and cutting, so to have some kind of ideal vagina, clitoris, whatever. So I think we need to have those in a common conversation and raise issues of kind of power and consent and body and so forth. And also, let me say that many of, it may also feel like I'm, this is a shorter version of a much longer book. Many of these elite African women and the leaders of these Tanzanian feminist organizations are my friends and colleagues, and many of them have actually kind of been changing practices and so forth. So this is, again, kind of set in a particular historical period. Questions, comments, concerns? Harvey.
It's understandable that one might not particularly like neoliberal economics, but it seems rather ineluctable. And I wonder if you could give a broader economic context to the situation in Tanzania and what, in fact, the economic alternatives are to what's happened to the Maasai.
Yeah, I mean, it's not changing, and it's something that clearly is not just in Tanzania, right? It's a kind of trend. I mean, I think we've seen spaces, especially in Latin America, where it's been contested in certain countries, and for better or worse, that's fading. And, in, again, the broader work, my position is not that this is all absolutely negative. I mean, I think especially when you think about the kind of accompanying political practices, the kind of demands for opening up a space that we call civil society, the promotion of these, and the very fact that these NGOs exist is in part and parcel of opening up other kinds of political spaces for different kinds of actors to engage. Now, again, they're still often heavily monitored and surveyed, and there's kind of limits on what they can do in terms of activism and advocacy, and that varies by sub-Saharan countries. The economic, what are the alternatives? I'm not sure much. What they are trying to do kind of is diversify livelihoods themselves, trying to figure out multiple ways of trying to survive. And what's happened is men now tend to migrate to the cities, there's extensive mining in this area, which again means that women are increasingly the kind of de facto heads of households, but without the de jure rights and responsibilities, right? Men are still kind of often supervising them from afar. Women themselves are desperately trying to find ways to raise money. I mean, money has become what is there. The issue is that the kind of broader issue I'm trying to challenge here is kind of the limits of law and legal remedies, because we often assume that somehow law, and in the larger book project, I kind of started looking at the kind of production of law and legal rights as we know them in the colonial period in Tanzania. The problem is the presumption is that the state is going to be some kind of just and equal enforcer of those, and they don't really accommodate when the state is indeed kind of the oppressor at times, as I've tried to show. And there's also the kind of notion that they're predicated on these individualized remedies. They kind of one by one you come before the court, where things like having your land, even, I mean, in the case of what the women are protesting, the land that the government is trying to take away is land that these communities tried to abide by the law. They had the land surveyed, they had it registered, they had titles for the land, and still the government is just saying, no, you can't have it anymore. So there's other communities that haven't done that, or they're in the process of doing that. So even when they held legal title, there was these very dramatic and quite violent efforts to evict and remove them. So, you know, the kind of neoliberal economics provides opportunities as well. I mean, it can provide a certain kind of economic space. The issue is the ways in which, you know, my work and the work of others, it's really exacerbated inequalities, right? So that, you know, when land, especially we've seen in areas, and for communities like Maasai, for whom the notion that somehow you could draw lines in the land and say, okay, this belongs to me, right, and that belongs to you, is just not even, you know, it belongs elsewhere, you know, and kind of that humans would own that. And, you know, they're catching up and they're doing it and they're trying to draw those lines, but it also means that when they're economically desperate, and we've seen this in other places in the world, they then sell the land, right, as the older woman said, and then they have nothing. Then they are the birds going from tree to tree. No land, no life. And so questions like arranged marriage and polygamy and whatever are kind of a very secondary, if not tertiary, set of issues. David?
Yeah, that was really interesting, Joe. I wonder if, you partly addressed this question when you talked about genital surgery among women and girls in the U.S. I mean, I wonder if from the Maasai women you're going to do the anthropological move of saying, well, they inform questions of gender or feminism within the U.S., within the global north, and so on. You know, their attitudes say about gender roles. Is there anything that we can or should learn from that? I think you're going to say no, but maybe you'll say it in a really interesting way.
Actually, I'm going to say yes. The point is that I think we can actually learn a lot from their forms of activism and from their efforts to collectively organize and protest. Things that, you know, a number of years ago, actually with, again, another colleague of ours, Ethel Brooks, we did a special issue of WSQ on activisms, and our goal was to try to look at kind of activisms that originate and take place in the so-called global South is really, you know, a way, something that we could learn from, right? Those of us who are kind of cynical in politics and, oh my God, that was before the current political moment. And, you know, are there things that we can learn from? Again, a kind of, not just kind of evidence from the South, but really, I mean, as the Comrades are calling it, kind of a theory from the South, right? And I do believe that we can learn from the ways in which, I mean, I'm not saying we all need to kind of strip naked on an airstrip, but the ways in which these women are really showing us, I think, the power of collective organizing, and that should speak well to you as, you know, the president of the AUP, collective organizing and collective protest in ways to kind of directly challenge and make visible these kinds of injustice that are really hard to address as individuals. Toyin?
Yeah, thank you very much. The point of fascination to me is how, as I was thinking about your presentation, they are using their own tradition to reform the reinterpretation of their tradition, which I think is very, very powerful, and which they are drawing a number of resources within.
Mm-hmm.
And as you are talking, I began to interject the region of the savannah in West Africa, current area of Middle Belt in Nigeria, and the Fulani, where some tendencies are unfolding as we speak. And there are two dynamics. The dynamics of violence, in which groups like these have acquired enormous quantity of AK-47. It's a tragedy that is waiting to similar in battle groups like that turn into the most fundamentalist of Christianity. Just to, it's a political economy of defining new forms of dignity. They say, okay, we've been assaulted, but we're not going to lose hope. And we still have to find dignity for ourselves. And then they look for alternative tests connecting the Bible to their own local experiences. I just want to say that this is a larger issue.
Oh, absolutely.
In a comparative context.
Absolutely. No, I mean, again, I can only draw, from what I do, but the way I was trying to pitch it is to suggest that and I was hearing some hums and nods, that it has broader relevance. Yeah. Salu?
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor. I really appreciate the lecture, and I have really learned a lot. And if you were in post-colonial study, I would call you a post-colonial anthropologist.
I'll take that.
Of the way you have really handled the topic, and then you did it in so objective a way that we don't really feel any form of essentialization, and I really appreciate it. And for me, I think you're just trying to, or that's what I think. Are you really trying to plead for a new review of gender, or our own perception of gender, how we really perceive gender, how gender is, or gender policy is being implemented on the ground? Because what the Maasai think to be priority for them is really different from what other people think to be priority for them, especially when you refer to what we call FGM, meaning female genital mutilation, depending on who is cutting and where in the part of the world the cutting is taking place. Because you mentioned it, we have in the US like what we call vaginal surgery, and then you have elongation in Zimbabwe, and even sometimes people, they refer to what we call control of women's sexuality to implement genital mutilation. It's not always the case, because sometimes it has nothing to do with controlling women's sexuality.
Right.
And even sometimes people, they refer to health problem. Sometimes it has nothing to do with health problem. And to really implement the policy, people, they refer it as a human right. I remember in one of my classes, some of my students were giving a presentation of female genital mutilation. And one of my students stood up and said, what are you saying about this issue? Have you ever gone through that experience? What do you know about it? I myself, I have gone through that experience. All the members of my community have gone through that experience, but there has been any problem so far. That's what she really said.
Right.
And I say it's a way of really looking at the issue, not about defending the issue, but really trying to understand how it is related to people's culture and not really fall into essentialization.
Right.
Now, coming to the notion of, are you pleading for a new review of concept? Because I see that whenever you talk about equality, sometimes you are very careful in even the term. And then I see that you are now using the word complementarity, and I think it's also very, very important. And the other issue is sometimes people are entitled to speak for a group of people instead of trying to listen to that group of people. And my last question is, coming to the notion of land deposition, don't you think that we should look at it not only at the government level, but also look at not from the inside, but also from the inside? If we refer to what I call corporate globalization,
Absolutely.
meaning gender and corporate globalization, or gender justice, human rights, and corporate globalization, to better understand why some government are really dispossessing one community of their land. Once again, I really appreciate it, and thank you for this.
Thanks. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer all of those here, but maybe I'll pick up a couple. Yes, absolutely. I mean, maybe starting with your last comment. I mean, my notion was not that somehow this was the kind of land dispossession, all this was somehow contained within Tanzania. I mean, that's very much this current kind of political economic moment that is that, the Arab hunting firms is the courting of hunters from the UAE and kind of giving them land. The government, the Tanzanian government currently seems more interested in trying to court and bring in outside capital from UAE, from South Africa, as Rick has documented, from other places, then in supporting the kind of rights and needs of its citizens. So no, very much, this is not something happening in isolation. It's absolutely about these other kinds of connections and trends. In terms of a new kind of way of gender, I mean, I am trying to push us to think about the kind of limits of a gender equality model. I mean, in my own, kind of politics, even in the United States, I actually speak more of gender equity, because I think that that's talking about some of these issues of kind of resources and property and rights and so forth. Whereas equality kind of, I think we've seen, and we're seeing it again at play right now in this contemporary political moment, there's a limit to kind of these status arguments of, I mean, legal status, we need laws, we need courts. I mean, that's a kind of first step. But there's a limit to what that can get you, right? Unless there's kind of implementation and enforcement and so forth. And I think the gender complementarity role is something important that we need to be attentive to. I mean, the bigger point, as I said, is really a political one of, as you suggest, that we need to not just listen to, but we need to hear what other people have to say and what they want in their world. So the bigger political project is one, and I take this term from my prior work in the indigenous rights movement, of self-determination. That is, that we need to be able to respect what people want as their priorities and their ways of the world. And again, we don't exist, it's not that they want to kind of live on some reserve, but we need to, respect what their priorities are and see what we, if we want to help, which can be problematic, then figure out from their agendas, not this imposition of our own agendas and views and presumption that we somehow know what's best for these other parts of the world. And especially, as I said, the kinds of folks who I've worked with for 30 years, the kinds many anthropologists don't want to work with. There's no glamour in it anymore. We want to work in urban areas and on texts and other things. But the kinds of folks I've worked with, my colleague Angelique, others, these, people living in these kind of rural communities, these remote communities, it's really important to get a sense of, how their lives have changed in the world, what their priorities are, what their agendas, and what they're doing to try to make that happen. Abby?
Yes, I'm glad you ended on that last point, which I think is, it is the crux of the matter, but in many respects is also the fundamental issue. You started talking about power, because the issue is, I was glad that you began with the UN instruments, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's, how do we get from Arusha to the table at the UN and keep those voices?
Mm-hmm.
Because the question of representation, the question of what kinds of things get listened to, I've never forgotten. The only time I really intimately had anything to do with this was over Beijing. And I was in Beijing. And I remember going to the debriefing of the girl child in the morning before the square brackets discussion was going to take place. And feeling quite upset because it was a wonderful session, but there was not, the African women were not in
Present.
charge of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were saying, we are the people who brought this issue to the table. But I know for the Ghana Committee, for instance, on the day on which that clause, the NGO committees were discussing it here to get ready for Beijing, you either had to have had the money to get to you, or you had to have the kind of space where you could call in and
Yeah, if I had that answer. But I think it's also, and I know that, you hear this. I mean, I agree, it's kind of people at the table and politics at the table, but even when African women, even elite African women are at the table, there's still a way in which they are perceived and moved, right? I mean, there's broader issues here about raced bodies and sexualized bodies. I mean, there's a reason that when I teach or you teach, right, a course on gender in Africa, the first thing students come to the table with is FGM that they want to talk about. And our colleagues who teach in India, it's sati, and there are these kind of iconic practices, right, that somehow are the kind of all-defining aspect of people's lives. Right, and did I think I would be writing? No, but this project actually has a genesis because you were in Beijing. I was in Nairobi in 1985 at the UN Decade Conference for Women. And so there's the kind of formal conference, and then there's alongside it what they call the forum, which is where the NGOs and activists and advocates come. And I can remember, and I guess I was 5 at the time. Sitting in a workshop. In fact, I begin the preface of my book with this instance. Sitting in a workshop that was on something like customary law and watching these older white American women act in what would politely be called a patronizing way, challenging their kind of younger African colleagues and demanding, why does FGM exist? Why are you still letting it happen? On and on and on and on and on, to the point where these educated African women literally had their backs against the wall, and I presume none of them supported the practice, but they were so offended by this onslaught that in a sense they ended up having to almost defend it and kind of defend against the kind of overt racism, frankly, that was being exercised. And that's kind of where this project starts. That's now, over 30 years ago, in that kind of conversation. And unfortunately, I think things are maybe a little more polite and modified, but some of that still exists. Carlos. Mm-hmm.
Because there's a clear purpose in my conversation where both in African studies and this is and other regions.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of discursive investment in the particularly by state actors.
Mm-hmm.
And so my curiosity is perhaps to what degree is there a comparative conversation across regional contexts, perhaps, that you're aware of, and perhaps to sort of stage it that way, because it's a conversation that I've been hearing a lot, not just within the anthropological circles and religious scholarly circles that I'm familiar with, but definitely.
No, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, part of this project emerges because we had a year where we had those conversations here at Rutgers. So when I was director of the Institute for Research on Women, one of the themes for a year, because the joy of that is you get to set these themes, was the rights of culture and the culture of rights, right? And we had faculty and advanced graduate students and global scholars from across, spend a year in actually a fabulous symposium that actually became one of the books that was talked about, The Gender and Culture at the Limit of Rights, were kind of excerpts from that. So I think absolutely those conversations are happening, and I have them in my mind in the context of giving a 40-minute talk. I can only piece it, but I think you're right. I mean, one of the people who's been formative for my own thought is actually Narayan's work in South Asia, and kind of some of her work on kind of the politics of culture, and that's in fact what we started out reading when we ran the seminar at IRW now a number of years ago. So maybe one last question. You guys have been exhausted and tired. I'll go to the vice president of the African Studies Association, Anne.
My question has nothing to do with my title. In your talk, you draw this distinction between modern, urban, elite women and rural.
Yeah, it's overdrawn.
Women, and you do sort of backtrack at the end of it to say that you didn't quite mean to suggest that these urban women are patronizing. But I wonder if you can, first of all, I don't think your story depends on that distinction. I mean, you can still have your story without kind of branding these urban women as somehow out of touch. But I also wonder if these women aren't as problematic as you suggest. In other words, it seems to me that there are many women involved in many urban women involved in movements where they do understand what goes on in rural areas. They're not that elite. They maybe have recently moved into the leadership. They may have recently migrated from rural areas, at least in some of the areas where I work. And I wonder if it's not possible to recognize that in many ways the demands of donors sort of push
Absolutely.
them into even making arguments that they really aren't that comfortable with. I mean, is that
Well,
part of your experience?
somewhat. I mean, certainly kind of donor-driven agendas is big. Again, in this presentation is kind of collapsing bits of a much bigger project. And for better or worse, in the longer book project, I look primarily at these, what I've not named here, but these two major Tanzanian feminist organizations, and give some of their history. And for many of them, and I have interviews and quotes with them, actually the kind of attitude I talked about is quite prominent. They talk about, those rural women, and we need to get them to do this and that. And again, not all of them. And as I said, some of them are beginning, have kind of seen the limits of that. Sometimes, of course, it's also that while they are based in Dar or sometimes Arusha, they make these efforts to kind of reach out to grassroots women, but they're also curtailed not just by kind of donor agendas that are demanding certain changes, but their own logistics and limits of resources, right? I mean, what it means to go, there's a reason these areas are kind of remote and rural. They're not necessarily easy to get to, and if you're going to bring people in, that takes money, it takes vehicles, it takes things you're familiar with, and so sometimes it's perhaps not bad intentions. It's just a lack of kind of possibilities. So no, I overdraw it a little bit in the talk, but I think it actually, the kind of elite grassroots, which is the way many African feminists and others kind of talk about it. I mean, it works, unfortunately, at some levels, but it is more complicated, perhaps, than I say. So, Stefan was here and then he disappeared. Oh, okay.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, for a fantastic. We want to present this to you on behalf of the Center for African Studies. I know a number of you have lingering questions, and so I want to invite you. We've got a reception out here in the hall, and we'd love for you to stay, have some food, have some drink, more conversation, and the best of luck with your presidency.